Preseason is just a few days away, and the Winnipeg Jets are ready to get to business. Find out what happened during practice on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you enjoy what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most importantly, we just love and appreciate your support, especially as we are getting ready to roll on with the Winnipeg Jets season. Going to be a big year. In tonight's episode, I want to chat about, some of the camp groups from the first couple of days, some early projected lines, and, a bigger conversation about if the Jets are really planning to run it back. Not the most ideal plan in my mind, and how I feel about all of this is complicated because the team just came off a President's Trophy. You look at where they were in the season rankings, and you'd say, what's the problem with running it back? And, well, I think it's complicated because if you really want to go further in the playoffs, I think the Jets eventually need to evolve. But maybe it's just not the season. So we'll talk a little bit about that, some of the camp groups. But before we dive into all of the fun stuff, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com and win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So, obviously, the Jets a couple of days ago released their camp groups and what to expect over the next couple of days. Obviously, training camp just kicked off earlier this afternoon, and these groups I don't think are going to be super shocking, right? A lot of these are in my mind pretty close to expectation. In the top group, you've got guys like Sandberg, Pionk, Miller, Clegg, a new guy, Ethan Frisch, and of course Anhorn, plus Hellebuck and DiVincentis, and then Velarde, Shaw, Koepka, Barron, Zilkin, Scheifele, Wagner, Pearson, and Connor. Now, I think what is interesting to see is Zilkin in this group. Zilkin, obviously, for the past couple of years, hasn't exactly had what you might call a stupendous couple of seasons. But the last couple of days, you heard me kind of glaze on about him a little bit. Really proud of what he did in preseason. I thought, or not preseason, but the Prospect Showdown, pre-preseason. I came away thinking he really reestablished himself as a guy to watch this season. If he really hits off with the Moose this year, don't count him out as a guy who could start to work his way into Winnipeg's bottom or middle six in the next couple of seasons. So very cool development. For Group 2, nothing too shocking here. Comrie and Milic in net, DeMello, Phillips, Heinola, Morrissey, Sautner, and Bauer for the defenders. And then at forward, you've got Nyquist, Taves, Ford, Jad, which is there, Anderson, Dolan, Gustafson, Barlow, Dewar, Owen Martin, Perfetti, and Lambert. Pretty interesting, I would say, Moose-heavy group. Not really a ton of guys who are likely to be starting with the Jets this year. For the most part, you've got a lot more of the top six in Manitoba really being represented. The last group, of course, you've got is Group 3, and this is Poulter and Washington and net. Then on defense, Shen, Fleury, Salamonson, Stanley, Engel, and Barteau. Not really shocking that this is probably more of the third pairing / top four Moose group. And then at forward, Nemesnikov, Iafallo, Fajimo, Jaeger, Niederreiter, Julian, Cloutier, DiGiuseppe, and Chibrikov. Now, of these groups, I guess I'm curious about number 2 and number 3, how they practice, how they look. These kind of like kid groups, I always think are very interesting for the Jets because Winnipeg's prospect pool technically doesn't rank that highly. I mean, you look at a lot of what the Jets are bringing to the Prospect Showdown, lots of mid-round picks, right? And I think where the Jets have drafted, they've done really well. But relative to other prospect pools, the Jets are still kind of working with some challenges. And so, a lot of this feels more like guys who are eventually going to become future depth players. If Walton was healthy and had a good prospect showcase, maybe we would have seen him here. But he did have a concussion from that hit earlier against the Habs. So that's really unfortunate. Otherwise, though, I don't think that there's too much here that's going to be super shocking from, the org perspective. And for me, I just kind of feel like we're sort of going back down a little bit of a similar path as to what we always do. And I sometimes wonder when it comes to like training camp and stuff, this feels like a really interesting opportunity to test out some stuff. And I wonder why the Jets don't make more of a lab of this. If you have an opportunity to maybe tweak some lines, try some experimental stuff, why not give it a shot in training camp? Maybe you have some unique combos. We already heard earlier today that Chevy sort of lamented a little bit the loss of Ehlers. I think that he would have loved to have had him back. Didn't work out. And now they have to sort of replace guys, a little bit mixture of internal options and external signings like Nyquist. My thoughts on Nyquist. Nice guy. Would have loved him a couple of years ago. Not sure now at this stage of his career that when you're asking him to become the next Ehlers, that he can necessarily handle that role. I think they're going to have to play a different game with him. And so stuff like this is where, I think training camp and preseason are really helpful because, frankly, I don't know what to expect from this Jets team. Looking at some of these groups, and, we'll talk a little bit about Connor Rabchak's observations from Winnipeg Sports Talk. He was there at camp earlier today and got to look at some of the top lines from each group. So, it's going to be an interesting next couple of weeks. I have a suspicion that I know where the Jets are going with a lot of the season. And, for me, I just feel like this is the time that you really want to spend trying to figure out if you've got something extra in the tank. You already know it's safe and familiar. Why not do a little bit more experimentation? Throw some stuff in the water, see what happens. Maybe you find some combinations and chemistry that you never expected. Will the Jets do this? No. We know how they are. We know what they do. They only really make changes when they're forced to, and I think that that's a little bit of a challenge over the last couple of years. And, you could argue that they've gotten really successful following their current model. But I think for me, this is where I'm looking to see how they think about taking that next step. So far, looking at these camp lines and stuff, the lack of surprise, I think, is sort of telling as to what the plan for the season is, how the Jets are likely to handle it, and all that stuff going forward. But we'll chat a little bit about the lines in just a moment. Again, nothing too shocking. I talked about what I thought the lines were going to be, and almost to a T, from practice in camp today, it looks to be lining up with my expectations. So whether that's a good thing or not, I have some, questionable thoughts. But if nothing else, camp's here. The Jets are almost back. It's going to be an interesting season. We're going to see what Taves has left in the tank. Obviously, this is a really huge signing from a Jets perspective, and every shift that he has in practice and camp and preseason, I'm sure, is going to be heavily scrutinized, closely watched and monitored. I said this previously. I think I would give him about a month or two before he starts to feel more up to NHL speed. That does seem like a long time, but he's been off for 2 years, right? We don't really know where his game's at. He's still working up to physical fitness. He said his skating legs a while back weren't 100% there, which, I mean, I couldn't really blame him. Like, you got to imagine a guy who hasn't played in 2 years is working his way back. It's going to take time. So, I think the important thing is to be a little bit patient with him. Although for the Jets, it is tough because Winnipeg is trying to make this a competitive window and play well now. So it's going to be interesting, right? And I think, looking at the line combinations for some of these groups, you sort of get where the Jets are coming from and what they expect out of this team. And I'll talk about where I think I see this going heading into kind of a run-it-back season, but with some interesting twists. Before we dive into some of the line combinations and talk about, what the Jets are trying to cook up here, didn't want to let you know about cooking up some big victories with FanDuel. The NFL season is well underway, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Maybe you're tuning into Monday Night Football, Bills versus Dolphins. Maybe you're expecting some big weekend matchups over the next couple of days. Obviously, Thursday Night Football, but for the week ahead, we've got Monday Night Football, Detroit versus Baltimore. We've got some big weekend games coming up, and if you really want to make the most of it, right? Whether you think who's going to win some of these individual matchups, or who you think is going to make the playoffs, maybe win their division, maybe even win the Super Bowl, this is your chance to get in your bets right now. If you're a new member, you get $5 down for a bet, and if it wins, you get $300 to keep those victories rolling. So, ready to play? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us at tonight's episode as we're chatting a little bit about training camp lines from today's groups. Connor Rabjack of Winnipeg Sports Talk, highly recommend you follow him on Twitter for very up-close updates and some quotes. He was watching camp today and had some line combinations from each group. Really, these are just like the top lines from each unit. So listen, you look at these lines, they're basically what I told you they were going to be about a week or so ago. You've got CSV as your top line, Nyquist, Taves, Perfetti as line 2, Iafallo, Nemesnikov, and Niederreiter as line 3, and Pearson, Barron, and Koepka for line 4. So for me, like, this group is okay. I look at this I guess 4-line combination. It's not really something that feels particularly high ceiling offensively. There's a lot of forechecking ability, and I think the first blush that I have is that it's going to be a very grindy, defensively oriented team, but kind of in the way that the Blues were for the last few years. St. Louis used to load their top line with a lot of their best scorers, and then the bottom 3 lines, you just sort of cobbled together a lot of forechecking ability, a lot of defensive acumen, physicality, and hoped that would be enough to carry you. I think the challenge with what happened for St. Louis was that, there's only so much that you can extract from trying to beat people senseless and sort of win wall battles and stuff. At some point, you got to find and squeeze out more goal scoring, and that's where the Blues roster has started to turn over and add more skill. With the Jets, I don't quite know how that's going to work. Nyquist, Taves, Perfetti in particular is going to be a very odd line to me because there's no foot speed here, not really a lot of transition ability, but you might be able to work it so that, Perfetti offers sort of a defensive bumper. But will that impact his game to the level to where maybe he's not able to do some of the more offensive stuff? Will Taves have, moments where he looks like he maybe should be maybe sitting a little bit more? Maybe he should be more in the bottom 6. I think I have some real questions about the second line. It's not going to be like last year's second line. I think that much is very clear. And I would anticipate that if they start to get pinned in the defensive zone, it could be a tougher stretch for them. So keep an eye out for that, how they sort of work around the lack of foot speed, how they do zone entries, what they do to set up. That stuff is going to be key to that trio being very successful, because passing and IQ-wise, they've all got it, right? Nyquist is a good finisher, very opportunistic. Taves is a multi-cup winning two-way center who at one point was one of the best in the league. So whether his body is there or not, his mind up there is still very sharp. Perfetti is a burgeoning talent who is, quite frankly, waiting for that next breakout season, whether it's this year or a different season. I think we really need to see him take that next step. And so this trio could work. I think that it needs maybe a little more foot speed to help with the transition so that you can get guys like Taves, Nyquist, and Perfetti in the right spots. The third line, this is really nothing shocking. Nemesnikov's kind of taking over the Lowry role. Iafallo, Nemesnikov, Niederreiter, you could call this the in line. It'll be fine. I don't expect a lot of offense. It'll be very defensively oriented. If you were to tell me one line that would look like a PK unit, that's probably these 3 together. So when they're on the ice, I don't think anyone's going to score, either for the Jets or for the opponent. This is kind of where I really wish Winnipeg would have given CSI another look. Look, I know that Iafallo is not really a top-line player on most contenders, but I think when you play him with Connor and Scheifele, they really balance their skill sets quite nicely. It's not going to work every game, but I think compared to what we saw with Connor, Scheifele, and Velarde, where they can have their skill take over, but it's inconsistent, CSI offered a little more forechecking potency. Iafallo was a great defensive valve. It's kind of like a sort of a CSP line, where you'd have Perfetti doing some of the same stuff. So Winnipeg keeps grouping a lot of their same kinds of players together, and I think that just sets them up for a game style that's not going to be ideal for your matchups. But We'll see. As far as Pearson, Barron, and Kepka are concerned, I mean, this is a fourth line. I told you Gustafsson was the odd man out. It's really not shocking that he continues to be iced on this team. I don't really know why Gustafsson doesn't get more love from the coaching staff. Gus, for me, is probably better than most of the guys on this trio. I think he offers more in transition. I think he's really developed into a two-way force, and Barron's a great finisher. I think if you paired him with Gustafsson, they'd make some really fun play together. Pearson, he'll bring a lot of experience, and Kepka, he's the energetic newcomer with some physicality. But I think Gus has more of a ceiling that could have at some point become maybe a middle six option. We're probably not going to find out because I don't think that Gus is really going to be playing for the Jets all that much this coming season. So, yeah, I see this team and I don't feel a lot coming out of it offensively. I think that's the first blush I have, and I'm not really shocked by any of these trios. I think the defensive pairings are probably going to be about what you'd expect. Don't be shocked if we see Stanley Shun on the third. You'll have Morrissey and DeBello as your first, and Pionk, Sandberg as your second, which that's fine. I think the blue line generally worked pretty well. The third pairing maybe had some issues at times, but as long as the top two pairings sort of held their own, which they basically did for most of the year, you didn't worry about as much because the third pairing just wasn't relied upon. Sandberg, Morrissey, those guys, they really carried the load. And as long as they were healthy, you didn't have to worry. If they do suffer an injury or something like that, though, that will start to ask some bigger questions of the group. And I don't quite know if the Jets internally have as clear an answer. I know Salomonson's probably rated pretty highly internally. He doesn't seem like he's quite ready for more NHL time, but by the same token, at some point he's going to have to play in the big leagues if you want him to play. He needs to get used to NHL timing and speed. So, yeah, we'll find out. I think if you'll notice, I talked about Gustafsson. I think Hanel is also going to fall into this conversation. We're starting to get to the point where at some juncture in the near future, the Jets are going to have to waive some guys, whether it's one or two defenders, a forward. Winnipeg is going to have to put some guys through the waiver process. They just have too many contracts on the books right now on the active NHL roster, and so they've got to move some stuff around to account for Lowry's cap hit and all that. So this is where things get a little bit funky. And I think, Hanela, Gustafsson, maybe Anderson Dolan, these players all are going to be potentially moved around a little bit. And, this is maybe their last chance for some big NHL time with the Jets. So it's going to be a very interesting couple of weeks as we roll into the start of the season, preseason, camp, all the stuff. There are going to be big battles. We'll see who really rises to the top. I will say it was cool to see Jokin get a top group billing. It doesn't mean that he's going to play on the top line or anything, but I think given his performance in the prospect showdown, it is good to see the Jets taking notice of who really stands out, who's putting in the time, and who could really help Winnipeg's Moose challenges this coming year. I think Jokin's going to be leaned upon heavily. I expect him to be a big figure for that top six. If he continues the way he has, he looked like a fringe option at the start of this year, and already just a couple of games into a prospect showcase, he looks like he's ready to turn his reputation around and really hit the bricks. So excited for him this year. Hope that it works out. And, for the Jets prospect pool in general, having another talented center join the group and really reestablish himself is nothing but a good thing. On the other hand, as far as the lineup is concerned, I want to talk a little bit about this whole thing about running it back again, and sort of two ways to think about this, right? Because I think the Jets aren't quite there with this group, both internally and with what they already have on paper. And I want to talk about, how they could still find a way to make this group even stronger as the season goes on. Before we do, though, I want to tell you how you can make your own finances stronger, both internally and externally with Monarch Money. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth. You've got 401ks, properties, or investments, and when you don't have the full picture about all of this stuff, you can end up leaving money on the table. Monarch Money is here to help. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or your phone. It's built for people with busy lives. If you've put off organizing your finances, Monarch Money is for you. It does all the heavy lifting and can help show you clear data viz, get smart categorization of your spending, and it'll even help you when you've got a partner or a spouse so you can share an account, set financial goals together, and make sure that you're always on the same page. Maybe you're spending a little more on streaming services than you realized. Maybe your investments haven't been doing nearly as well as you anticipated. Monarch Money can help collect it all in one spot in an easy-to-use app or web interface so that you'll always get exactly what you need at your fingertips. So don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNHL. Greetings, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we're chatting a little bit about, whether the Jets are running it back and how overall, we should feel about this, right? And I sort of go back and forth because, there's part of me that's pretty okay with the Jets returning with a regular season lineup that looks like mostly of what we had last year. I knew going into the season there would probably be a level of pain, right? We're not going to see President's Trophy quality hockey. I think that was a really special moment in the franchise's history and one that, it'll take some effort to really repeat. But now the focus becomes the Stanley Cup. And whether it's fair or not, that has to be kind of the Jets' goal. I think Winnipeg doesn't really have a choice anymore. They have to find a way to make the next 3 years as productive as humanly possible. And I don't quite know if that's going to be this year. I look at this roster and the lines I just told you about, and I think the broader sense that I have is the Jets are going to be fine for the regular season, but during the playoffs, unless there's a big internal promotion, maybe a big trade or something, we're going to see a team that can handle maybe a wild card opponent, maybe a first-round opponent that's a little bit lower seeded. But beyond that, the Jets are going to have some challenges if they maybe come up against a Colorado or a Dallas or one of these teams. And yes, Colorado is not infallible either. They've had their own issues. The Stars ran into the Oilers last year and also got butchered. And now they have a new coach that I'm not 100% sold on. But all that said, the talent differential already is a little bit of a disadvantage for the Jets. And so this season feels like one where there's an opportunity to really turn this squad around and start to integrate the youth over the course of the year. I don't think that's the plan. I think the Jets are going to try and tread water with this group, see how far they get with Hellebuck, the power play, and a really defensive style kind of winning the day. And if things go really well, they can make some big trade deadline acquisitions and go from there. But I think the risk that they sort of run with this approach is that, last year we already saw what happened when they didn't do well at the trade deadline, and I felt like that might have been one of their big opportunities. Do I think that they would have won the cup with that group, even with a big trade or two? Probably not, but at least you take the swing. With this group, you have a much higher threshold for needing to trade for guys. You need to bring in more talent offensively, and I feel like the Jets are now 2 to 3 pieces away from being a deeper playoff contender. So it's a tough call. I look at this team. I think that there's going to be some quality defensive plays. I think that they're going to be relentless in the corners and really aggressive on the forecheck. And I think that'll get them some good purchase, but I don't know how far it really takes them in the postseason. And if they do make a trade and try to make a splash, the Mason McTavish situation is still out there. We heard from some player poll today that somebody, maybe Seth Jarvis, said he would have loved to have been traded to Winnipeg at one point. Maybe there's something where the Jets in, the coming seasons, whether it's this one or the next couple of years, they try and bring in some talent. But I think this season, I feel like is one where, plan A for the Jets is not going to be that great. I think it'll be fine for the regular season. They'll probably be competing for, an upper end spot in the seeding of the Central. But I just think the ceiling for them is always going to remain modest until they can show that they really change things and they want to maybe bring in guys like Lambert a little bit more, maybe Chibukov to help try and move the needle, or they make a big trade. I just think the Jets are in a good spot, but not a great one if they're trying to make this their 3-year competitive window. But curious to know how you feel about that. Do you look at this team and feel the same way? Where do you see the squad going? Because from what I feel, I probably am expecting a first-round exit, or if they do make it out of the first round, probably not too long into the second round. I don't expect them to win a ton of games against tougher competition. So long road ahead for the season. A lot could change. Maybe Taves has the renaissance year that a lot of people seem to believe he's capable of. Maybe Perfetti takes that elite next step. Maybe the Jets make a big splash and trade, and somehow we walk away with the piece that just turns this franchise around completely. I don't know what to expect this year. I have some thoughts on it. I've seen the Jets do a lot of this stuff before, and we usually know how it ends, but we always like a surprise every now and then. Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at @LO_Winnipeg Jets. Tomorrow's episode, obviously, we'll talk a little bit more about the preseason games this weekend, and then also a little bit about the Kyle Connor contract situation. We finally have some clarity that it appears an extension is underway. We'll hear how close. We'll talk about how close it is, kind of think through, how likely it is that this impacts the future and present of the Jets, how it might do so, and how the Winnipeg Jets can try and go from being merely a really good regular season and maybe even solid playoff contender to taking that next step and becoming a truly elite franchise. But we'll save that for tomorrow's conversation. For tonight's show, that's all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We will see you back here tomorrow with even more Winnipeg Jets talk. It's going to be a long year, going to be a fun one, and I am looking forward to having you all along for the ride. So get ready, strap yourselves in. It is almost Winnipeg Jets hockey time.